Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have great pleasure in welcoming you all to this evening's talk by Rahul Mehrotra and Naman Ahuja, organized by the Marg Foundation in collaboration with Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Vastu Sangrahalaya. Now, the talk by our two speakers, who are acknowledged academics, lecturers, authors, conversationalists, and whose credentials are so evenly matched that they have drawn a record audience today to speak on the intriguing subject of tents, cities on the move. Now, I don't know if I really need to introduce Rahul Mehrotra and Naman Ahuja to this audience, but for the sake of formality, I will do so with the utmost brevity, for which I hope the speakers will excuse me. Rahul is the founder principal of RMA Architects. He divides his time between his practice in Mumbai and Boston, where as a professor of urban design and planning, he teaches at Harvard University. He's well known for the books he's authored, and I'll name just two: The Kumbh Mela, Mapping the Ephemeral City, and The Kinetic City, and other essays. Now, notably, Rahul played a seminal role many years ago in introducing our city planners to the concept of heritage precincts. He must feel gratified that the humble workshop on the Fort Precinct, which he led at UDRI in 1994, culminated in the fort area being listed as a World Heritage Site in 2018. Though perhaps he's not surprised that there was a 31-year gap between the two, which so well demonstrates the speed of doing business in India. Now, Naman Ahuja is a professor at JNU New Delhi and a curator specializing in art history. Among his several publications are The Making of the Modern Indian Artist Craftsman, The Body in Indian Art, and more recently, Gandhara, A Confluence of Cultures. As general editor of Marg, Naman's literary and academic prowess are breathtaking. You have only to read the introductions to each of the dozen-odd quarterly issues which have been published in the last 3 years to appreciate the immense width and depth of his scholarship. Now, coming to the talk, how does the humble, almost mundane subject of the tent justify a lecture by two such heavyweight scholars, or indeed an entire 150-page issue of Marg? Now, for many of us who are lucky enough to be living in pakka accommodation, the tent, ephemeral, impermanent, transient, may bring back early memories for some of us of, say, the circus in the Azad Maidan, or cinema tents if we grew up in Mufassal areas, or as in my case, tents in Boy Scout camps, which brings to mind a limerick from Edward Lear. A group of young Boy Scouts in Kent were thrilled to be living in a tent. They'd play and they'd shout and camp all about, but a downpour left them soggy and spent. But more seriously, if you were to ask your friends to name, say, a dozen different types of tents, do you think they would be able to do so? Well, which is why we are all here today to hear about tents in a much greater set of dimensions. And that's why I think this talk promises to be unusually rich. Just not a lecture on the typology of different types of tents, but more likely the opportunity, in Rahul's words, to open a conversation about the various forms of temporalities, the ephemeral, and their spatial practices. For example, could the Mughal tents, despite their apparent immateriality, possibly inform their planning of their then cities? Consider that in the 36 years that the Mughal Emperor Akbar had his capital in Agra, he was away in camps for 22 years. And of the 22 years of Jahangir's rule, he was similarly away for 14 years. So could it be that it was not Fatehpur Sikri that influenced the shape and form of Mughal tents, but rather the tents that influenced their city's design and spatial layout? But between the extremes of the Boy Scouts tent and the stunning opulence of the Akbar tent, which can be seen in the Calico Museum, there lies a boundless arc of history, one that encompasses tents of the earliest nomadic communities, whether Mongol tribes, or Arab Bedouins, or Ladakhi Tibetans, or even our own Banjaras, to those more familiar to us, tented markets, luxurious wedding tents, and in sad contrast, the growing number of refugee camps, whether of Palestinians or Rohingyas. But I'm sure today we will hear of some of the self-built tented settlements of enormous scale, such as the Kumbh Mela Nagari with its mind-boggling numbers, but also equally significant but lesser-known ones, such as the similar annual mammoth gathering of Muslim pilgrims from over 100 countries in neighboring Bangladesh, the Bishwa Ijtima, in the Tongi town on the Turag River, just 14 kilometers out of Dhaka. Here is a pop-up settlement that houses 4 million visitors for just 6 days before it is divided, disassembled, and returned to the city and repurposed for other uses, informal, formal, or modern. And the cover issue of this Marg issue on tents features a photograph of this particular settlement at night. And in glaring contrast to the piety of this site, the exquisite watercolor description of the notice for today's wedding, a military encampment, an Afghan military encampment 2 centuries ago, which reminds us of how tents accommodated kitchens and courtesans, barbers at the treasury to keep armies on the move. And indeed, finally, much closer to home, where Punjabi farmers waged their recent non-violent battle with government on a highway into Delhi, their tents sheltered families on tractor trolleys, housed even a dental clinic, and the press of the insurgent daily trolley times. So, what we can look forward to this evening from Rahul and Naman as they cover this vast canvas, no pun intended, will be their original, unique insights into how so elementary and skeletal a construction such as a tent can inform us about societal relations, piety and conflict, urban design, climate resilience, and so much else. So may I now request Rahul and Naman to come up and make their presentation. Who would like to come first? Naman comes first. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. And thank you very much, Cyrus, for a wonderful introduction. I think you've summarized things exquisitely. It's been really rewarding to put this volume together and to be able to share one's ideas with all of you over here through Marg. It's a great pleasure for me also because I love coming back here to CSMVS. And it's like a good network of friends that is just expanding, and one's being able to share one's ideas with all of you over here. So thank you very much for the invitation to be here. Thank you for the collaboration, Mr. Mukherjee. This is particularly useful for us to be able to do this. We are neighbors, and I think this is excellent that we can continue with this kind of neighborly activity and support each other in this way. So thank you. I'd like to begin because actually the subject of this particular volume came to my mind when it did initially, when India and the world was being debated in these rooms up here, and then at the Getty, and then at the British Museum. And I remember being vexed about a particular gallery called Courtly Cultures. And I felt like a good JNU wala as to why should courtly culture be given such prominence in this gallery, and why can't every man's art be put in the gallery instead? Why should it be courtly culture only, and why can't we have something else? And this is a photograph of the red tent panel that I'm going to talk to you about on display in the CSMVS galleries upstairs. But actually, it was an opportunity to think much more, and it was challenging for me to be able to be forced to think as to what is the impact of courtly culture. Is courtly culture influenced by society? In what ways does courtly culture influence society? Does the courtly culture of one people influence another, and in what ways does that influence carry? What does a tent symbolize in terms of mobility? This particular object held so many stories within it that actually while brainstorming with Rahul Mehrotra on it, we were able to come up with a fantastic table of contents that we have lined up for those of you who wish to. Now, as Cyrus just said, we have tried to cover in this volume various aspects of what tented encampments really mean and what their civilizational importance is. Rahul's already been part of a fantastic project on the Kumbh Mela, and I'll leave it to him to talk about some of these things, and that's one issue that we briefly touch on. Tents have always been used by armies on the move, going from one location to another, and we've tried to create a little collage of a few important photographs to be able to think about the rich history of this. Tents are used at times of entertainment, and we've got circus tents that we've looked at, and how circuses can become opportunities to ensnare the public, and so how the Viceroy, Dufferin, was a patron of various circuses that would happen in South Asia, and how South Asia's circus actors, clowns, and animal trainers began to be used in circuses all over the world. So there's a history over there about how the circus moves. Tents are there as something ephemeral that comes up on the spot like a pop-up, as was mentioned. And cinema tents is one way of thinking about it, where these trucks go which carry screens in them for the entire village and the community to come together for a mela and come and watch movies. But tents have long histories in anthropology, and we've dealt briefly with the history of the Bedouin tent. And the reason why the Bedouin tent has been singled out for particular scrutiny is because the type of tent that was used by the Bedou is of I shouldn't say one type, there are actually three main types of tents, become the basis for a lot of other tents that are used all the way up into Central Asia and then Ladakh, and all the way into European tents that we get in Venice and even in Western Europe. The principles of tented construction that have been studied by anthropologists in Arabia and going all the way amongst the Berber are extremely important. And we looked, therefore, it was important in the history of the world when you're trying to tell through a brief volume on tents to be able to deal with the anthropology of the Middle Eastern tent. It was extremely relevant. Monisha Ahmed has written a lovely chapter on the tents of Eastern Ladakh. And it's extremely perceptive because the key question that you ask, that we all respond to, and sometimes as leftists we all respond to, oh, what a wonderful world, we don't have a sense of private ownership of land. So you say we're all on the move, nobody has private property, right? You defy the concept of private property. How untrue. And Monisha's piece was particularly good because she made it a point to include in her piece and respond to the obvious challenges and misperceptions that we would all have in thinking about tented townships. And she immediately, without staging the question, she answers it beautifully in that piece and said that there are specific routes that nomads have and pasture lands that they control, and those are hereditary. And so, whereas you might imagine that there is no singular private ownership of land, amongst nomadic people too, there is a hereditary claim to the pastures that they would use and the routes that they would ply. So it's not that this is some magical, utopic, pure space of tented townships on some other where people have no concept of private ownership of land. They do. But there is certainly a greater living within the environment, a greater sense of harmonizing with the land and the water resources and the sky and the animals that you are dependent on. That much is certainly true when we study tents. And that brings us into the world of Central Asian nomadism. And we have a couple of chapters that deal with the idea of urbanism in the steppes. Julian Jain has contributed a fantastic essay on looking at how tents, the yurt, is actually constructed and how they are passed on and the kind of weaving that it supports. So in my own study for this volume, I decided to work on one particular tent. One particular tent, the remains of which have been getting smuggled out of the Toshakhana of the treasury in Jaipur for the past 100 years. And little bits of this tent, most of it had already left Jaipur before 1984, and 16 panels of this particular tent are now lying scattered in different museums and collections all over the world. And we've been trying to put it together to understand what this grand tent would have been like and how it might have been used. And while trying to reconstruct its history, I began to think about what red tents were used for. What history do we have? And here is a wonderful painting from the Babar Nama that actually shows people of different ethnicities coming together, skinning a deer, making kebabs on a tandoor and skewering them in this near a red tented enclosure, which is a tented enclosure that had been erected near Kohat. Now, Kohat is in Pakistan and on the borders of Multan and the northwest frontier, and where Babur had encamped. And for the governors and the local elite of the Kohat area, he threw a massive feast. And of course, the emperor would meet them from his red enclosure, while the rest of the guests had come around there and food was being cooked for them. So I began to think about this idea of how far back is royalty associated with using the red tent, and what were their red tents made for? In the Islamic world, the history of the red tent certainly can be recorded from Seljuk times, when it became standard that the Lal Dera is what we call it in Rajasthan. The red tent would be used only for the Sultan or for the king, and the rest of the tented enclosure would be made in whatever other material you wanted. These tents were so valuable that they were given in dowry. So Temur's daughter was given a tent, for instance, in her dowry. Tents were hereditary, and they were passed on long lineages. They're so important, as I said, the Jaipur one lies not in the Farash Khana, but in the Tosha Khana. Now, Farash Khana would be the place where all the textiles would be kept and other such things, but the Tosha Khana is where honors or where things of state gifts are maintained and kept. And so for the fact that it's in the inventory lists of the Tosha Khana is in itself quite revealing, because it tells us the kind of value that was associated with this tent. It's a ceremonial tent. It's a tent that's taken out for special occasions. So what can we reconstruct of this history? This particular tent panel that lies in the National Museum, as I said, is one of 16 that lies in different collections now. It's made of red-colored velvet, and it has a very simple varak decoration made of gilt that has been applied on it. It's not a very luxurious tent. The most luxurious of Mughal tents are embroidered. They're made of raised velvet. They're made like damask. They have a pile in some sections, and they have flat weaving in others. They have a lot of brocade. They're very intricately woven. This is pretty rough and ready. Take a stamp, put glue on it, stick the glue on the velvet, apply gold leaf, brush it off, You've got a ready panel. Roll it up, next panel to be made. And that means that you're churning out these panels quickly. And so when you want to make a larger encampment, print a few dozen more. When you need a smaller encampment, use a few panels less. It's got a certain flexibility because of the way it's made. Velvet is something that is surprisingly strong as a fabric. It's thick, and yet it has a sheen. So it's cost-effective, it's lasting, it has the desired effect on people as a royal enclosure without having to break the bank in terms of making something super luxurious and embroidered and hand embroidered. So it's quickly made, this particular tent. And that in itself tells us a lot about the nature of what is the desired effect of this kind of habitation. We have lots of evidence of the Mughals using tents if we start looking at their paintings. The Hamzanama being amongst the earliest, the Akbarnama being another. Tents were the royal homes away from home. As we just heard, the Mughal emperors actually spent more than half their lives, even though they constructed these grand palaces of Sikri and Agra and Lahore and wherever else, they didn't actually spend all that much time in those palaces. They spent more time in their tented encampments than they did in those stone palaces of theirs, which makes it important for us to look at these tented encampments as the norm rather than the exception. Yet when we have told Mughal architectural history, we've only done it on the basis of the stone architecture of Delhi, Agra, Lahore, and so on, quite forgetting that those were only partially used. Coming back to this particular tented panel, we found the panels of different sizes, and they were obviously used in different parts of the tented enclosure. The tallest panels are about 1.5 stories high, and they would have formed the inner core of the palace interior where the darbar was. And the rest of it would have made the outer enclosure. Being a little over 2 meters high, the walls themselves are of a height such that you can't peer over them even when you're on horseback. And that's an interesting height because you have to think about the palace functioning. We've often thought about how did you manage to live with these walls and this tented enclosure? Wouldn't there have been too much dust? I mean, think about all of these being put up in Delhi and Agra and Jaipur and across Rajasthan and the amount of sand and dust that's blowing. So these tents would have been filthy. And velvet can take a good beating. The other thing with velvet is that the ground around the tent would have been laid down with lots of canvas and lots of textile, would have made up like daris and matting all around it. And these tented enclosures were a few square kilometers in total, with many, many hundreds and thousands of carpets that built up this entire tented city with many walls and enclosures. So thinking about the nature of the palace and their different fittings, these tented walls even had windows, and they had awnings, and they had windows which had openable flaps. And so when you look at these chattais, these chicks that you see in the background, they're fascinating because they've each got a silk yarn that's been wrapped around each reed, turning it into a patterned chick that would have been down on the windows. And so you see all of these Mughal motifs on these. You get an idea of how you would have maintained ventilation and using chicks, but with a pattern as they would have been rolled up as these houses would have moved. There's been a bit of a debate. Was this particular tented panel used on the exterior of a building, or was it intended for the interior? I firmly believe that initially this particular velvet tent was intended as an exterior, but over time, by about the late 18th century, 100 years after it was made, it began to be used for the interior, to line the interior walls instead of being used for the outer walls. And I'll try and explain that as I come to the end of my slides. From the outside, how would this tented township have looked? You would have seen a series of cusped arches with this poppy motif in the center. Now, cusped arches became quite popular in the reign of Shah Jahan and continued afterwards. And looking at the stylistic features of this particular cusped arch, it seems to be from that late Aurangzeb period overlapping with Jai Singh of Jaipur. Now, since it's found in Amer in Jaipur, it's likely to have been from that particular period of about the 1680s, 1690s is when it must have been made. These tented townships was so grand that Abul Fazl clarifies that there are two main types of encampments. Small ones which are used for short journeys like hunting parties, while larger camps were like townships, were intended for royal military expeditions. He says that the Gulal Bar, or the Red Wall, is erected first as a great fence which has been brought to use by Akbar. And then he says that the office of the tent pitcher is so important that he is of the same rank as a governor in the administration. So the man who looks after the tents is quite important. There were two great royal tents. One would be sent in advance. So in an encampment with about 100 horses and 50 elephants, all of the one tent would be sent to the next location while you were camping in one. You left, the entourage would leave this encampment to go to the next encampment where that would be ready, while the staff would pack up this one and move to the next destination. And so the tented township, there were two of these tented townships, and they would carry on moving slowly, and that was the very slow progress of the army going from place to place. Now at each of these places, something remarkable was happening. There were markets inside these tented townships. There were courtesans, there were dancers and musicians, there were theatrics, there were all kinds of things that took place within this township. The king gave audience to people locally and met his public at each location and sorted out disputes wherever he was. So the tented township is also a new kind of method of thinking about mobile sovereignty. People aren't just coming to the emperor to meet him in the capital. The king is going to the people in different places. Guess where CSMVS got the idea of its mobile bus? The museum goes to the public, in the same way the emperor goes to meet the public in different places. Now, the reason why I don't think that these red panels were the interior is because at the V&A, we have found some exquisite tent panels of brocade, which are made in these pastel colors, which are a dull gold embroidered with rosettes made of pink, shades of pink and pale green. And this is the interior of that tent. And these are very much the palette of the high point of the Mughals from the Shah Jahan into the Aurangzeb period, where they would have used that kind of a palette for the interior, and it would have been this dull gold, which is, of course, a pure gold interior, rather than use velvet on the interior, which is perhaps a little too loud for the interior design. And looking at this, one realizes how interior design changed over 100 years. So for students of design who are looking at shifting tastes in India, you can get an idea of how the interior shifted from the 1650s to the 1780s, 1790s. What's the shift in interior design? And by the time I said, by the time you reach the 1770s, 1780s, that becomes the design, the design that you want for the interior. And the Mehrangarh red velvet tent is very much an interior design of one of these grand, sumptuous interiors. Now, as I was saying, these tented townships are a place for encounters. And if you're lucky, the Sultan comes, the Nawab or the Emperor comes to give audience to people, but at other times he can just come and plonk himself in your territory, in your land, and lay claim to your land. And so this mobile sovereignty is something quite interesting. This is an interesting painting in the Padshahnama because it shows Shah Jahan camped in the area of Rajasthan, and you see the Maharana of Mewar coming to meet Shah Jahan. And these kinds of encounters are taking place very much within the red enclosure, within the red tented enclosure where they are meeting. And so these become places where cousins get to meet. Now you must remember that the Mughal family by this stage is three-quarter Rajput, right? They have sort of married and intermarried. So as far as their first cousins and second cousins are concerned, they grow up playing in the zanana in the Rajput palaces with their Rajput cousins. And so their engagement with their Rajput cousins is so deep at this stage that this is where a lot of ideas are being shared within the elite families. And they are actually getting to see each other's spaces and inhabit each other's spaces in these places. In Jodhpur, we also had something else. Maharaja Abhay Singh, who ruled from 1724 to 1749, emulated Mughal courtly culture to be able to assert his own authority. He came to power in less than noble circumstances through fratricide, and he needed to establish himself, and so he used the Mughal tent as a way for his own authority, as his own palace, where people could come and meet him. And so that's what we see when I was talking about the idea of mobile sovereignty. Now, the velvet, and for those of you who are interested in textile design, I think I should say something about this. The exciting thing about this particular tent was that when the Textile Society of New York analyzed the red dye for this tent, they found that it had been made red using two different substances. The velvet had first been dipped in lakh. Now, lakh is a very particular Indian dye. You can use manjishta, you can use any other red that you want to use, but they had not used those, they had used lakh. And lakh is a dye which is made by boiling up insects, right? It's not a very vegetarian dye, right? You boil up insects and you use it for your bahi khatas. All your bahi books are made with that red textile in which, now, a boiled up residue of one insect keeps other insects away from it. It acts as a kind of an insect repellent, right, for the other insects. And that's a really clever way to use the dye. And in India, where you've got the biggest problem of termite infestation and important records and accounts being eaten up by insects, this becomes something really useful for conservators to know. So when you use an insect-based dye, it keeps other insects away from it. And maybe that's why this red velvet panel has survived. But the other exciting thing about this red velvet panel was that it was double dipped. And the second time, it was dipped in cochineal. Now, cochineal is derived from a South American insect. And that means that the dyers of Amer had already started receiving South American dyes by the 1680s, which had come all the way through the European traders, been brought to them in Jaipur, and double dipping it in a second red insect-based dye is quite interesting. So the movement from the Americas to India had already started taking place. And that brings up its own story of mobility. Just as much as the tent is a symbol of mobility, even the method of making this tent is a symbol of mobility. Then comes the whole issue and the controversy about velvet. What do we call velvet? Not chenille, really. It should be called makhmal, but makhmal, which makhmal? And we have two words in Farsi, makhmal-e-badla baf and makhmal and the other makhmal, which is makhmal-e-farang. Now, the Firangi makhmal is the interesting one that we need to look at, because the Firangi makhmal is what is the real word for velvet. And a lot of these velvets were supposed to have been made in Venice or made for the Ottoman court and traded between the Turks and the Venetians, and are supposed to have been imported by the Seljuks and then had come to India. But it turns out that by the early Mughal period, by the mid-Mughal period, by Shah Jahan's reign, velvet had already started being made in 2 or 3 workshops in Hindustan itself. Perhaps one in Assam, perhaps one in UP, those for sure, and maybe one in Lahore was also making velvet. The study of velvet, strictly speaking, for textile specialists, is like making a towel or like making a carpet. You're making something where you're knotting a pile into the warp and weft and then cutting the pile at an even height to be able to make it like a carpet. It's very much the same as carpet weaving. And India has been famous over centuries for making flat weaves without a pile. But making carpets is something that actually starts in India only in the end of Akbar's reign or early into Jahangir's reign is when the first time when weaving with a pile comes up. And weaving with a pashmina pile or a silk pile, which is what you need when you come to velvet, starts later. You originally start making on a cotton warp and weft, you start weaving with a wool pile, and then later you make it more refined as time goes on. So I think this particular velvet is not imported. I think it must have been made in India, and it might have been made anywhere in northern India, and then they used imported dyes for it. Now, etymologies is something that I think is very important, because when we use words for all of these things, what do we call them? You know, we get so caught up with identity politics that we need to think of words. For instance, the word shamiana. It's a Farsi word, right? It's not a Hindi word. The technique by which these things are made. What are the words that the craftspeople, the weavers, are using? And what does that word tell us about where that technology has come from? So, for instance, the word varak, which is what they are using to make it. Now, varak is an Arabic word. It doesn't have a Sanskrit or a Hindi or a Gujarati equivalent. And so it's interesting to think where the technology of making these things comes from by looking at the etymologies of the words themselves that the craftspeople are using in Hindustan to be able to understand where did that particular technique come from. And this takes us into the history of these particular migrations of these technologies is where they're coming from. Now, as I was saying, these chicks and velvets can be dated. And these are some of the Shah Jahani velvets, which are from the earlier period. And you can see the difference. They have bold poppies coming out of stems or irises and other flowers treated on a brocaded background. So there's a different aesthetic. They don't look like the ones of the later period that I'm showing you. So there's a way to be able to date these things. And the very early ones which are made for Akbar, the arch is not cusped, and it's just got a single spray of flowers in each archway. They're quite different from the ones that and they're narrower arches compared to what we've got. But by the time we reach the paintings of Kota or Jaipur in the late 18th and early 19th century, you can see that it's the exterior which is being made white with these beautiful Mughal flowers, while the interior is made of this red velvet with the gold varak flowers. So the design has been flipped 100 years later. And these paintings are a good guide to see the shift in the aesthetics of the interior design in between the Mughals to the Rajputs. I'm going to end with a couple of slides. Tented cities provide some of the experience that we needed to be able to understand urban planning. Looking at these tented townships and the plans for these tented townships makes us understand how Fatehpur Sikri was conceived and how urban planning was first tried out in a tented encampment and then promulgated in a city. Besides their physical mobility, tents like the ones from Amer and Jaipur speak of the migration of artisans and the technologies that these artisans brought with them. Etymologies is something else that I focus on in my paper, as I was saying. And the most fascinating of all etymologies, I think, is the word for tent itself. The Mongol Chagatai word for a tent is Urdu. The word Urdu itself means a tent which brings diverse people and cultures together, where they speak in their own languages, not creating some kind of pidgin or Creole to be able to get by, but eventually creating something which is refined. If you think about 2-3 words like this, there is another fascinating word from my part of the world where I come, my ancestors come from, which is called Saraiki. And that's a language which means Sarai Ki, literally Sarai Ki Boli, the language that is spoken in the Sarai. And so we have 2 interesting languages, the language of the tent, Urdu, and the language of the Sarai, Saraiki. And that's quite interesting because it's about a language that is created out of mobility, out of a diversity of people, a language in which fine poetry can be composed and sung. And I think if tents can achieve a cultural apogee to a point where they become the symbolic of language itself, then we, as art historians or as architects and designers, certainly need to pay tents a little bit more attention. Now, on the subject of design, I have lots of people to thank. A volume like this, Marg, would never get created unless lots of people contributed. The first time I got the opportunity to write this up was on a platform for Gyanprava in Varanasi, and they published my studies on this. And I thank Bimla Podar a lot for making sure that I delivered this particular essay. I also want to thank Rahul Jain, who's been a great friend, Avni Sood, who helped me through a lot of the research, and Byron Hammam, who actually was very helpful in looking at Venetian velvets and cochineal histories across the world. I want to thank Praful and Shilpa Shah very much for allowing me access to their wonderful pieces in their collection. And to the Dar al-Athar al-Islamia in Kuwait, Sue Kaukji, who made the Kuwait Al-Sabah collections available to Marg to be able to publish it. Anamika Pathak at the National Museum, who made the textile collections of the National Museum available. But a lot of people at Marg, it takes a phenomenal editorial board to be able to bounce these ideas off, and Rahul is an integral member of that editorial board, as is Nancy Adajania, Muzaffar Alam, Phyllis Granoff, Cameron Petrie, David Schulman, and now Debbie Swallow as well. And at Marg, creating pages like this and designing volumes like this and then marketing volumes like this and administering it all doesn't just happen overnight. So thank you very much, Jyotsna, Sharmila for editing, Simran, Malvika Madgulkar, Aditya Mohanan, and Parvati Venkataraman for your design. Almitra, thank you very much for all that you do, and Mary for wherever she is holding the fort, Gautam for all the design works and processing that he does, Usha for running Marg, Mansi and Srirang as well. Thank you all very much, and above all to our trustees who make sure that every time we have a bestseller, here's the great paradox of Marg. We sell you Margs over here at 500 rupees each. It costs us about 1,500 rupees to produce one. So where does the remaining 1,000 rupees come from? Well, that's our trustees' job. And every time we have a bestseller, because you buy up our stock, everyone says, do a rerun, and I have to look at my trustees and say, you gotta do a rerun. And so a rerun is a greater burden for us, but that's all for your benefit. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Naman. Thanks, Saris, for that generous introduction. Well, Saris, you actually very pithily summarized my entire lecture. So what I'm going to do is now expand those ideas, more or less. But, I think what has been very interesting about the process of doing this issue, working with Naman, is that we came from 2 completely different perspectives. I mean, Naman from the perspective of a historic view on this, and I came from a perspective of urbanism, and how does this sort of inform how we might look at urbanism. So what I'm really going to share with you, because he's talked to you already about the structure of the issue, I'm going to actually share with you some of my own research on urbanism, which began to inform a direction where we intersected, and I think this issue was born, which was the Kumbh Mela, but ephemeral urbanism more generally. So I'm going to take you through that journey. And so it really is premised on the idea, and this comes from just my experience in Mumbai. Cyrus mentioned the fort area. We all worked on conserving the fort area. And I think that began to, at some point, seeing how people occupied space made me think about the city slightly differently and challenging the idea of the city as a static and staple entity, which is, I think Naman touched upon this in a completely different way, but that really is the premise of a lot of this research, which is also how do you design transitions and not absolute solutions. I mean, I think that image you had where you talked about how they spent more time in the tents outside the palace was also a mode of engaging with nature, and that can take on many dimensions, which are seasonal, which work on a temporal scale, and all of that. And so I think, we instrumentalize architecture often for absolute solutions. So therefore, are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems? Was the deepest provocation here when some of this research was triggered off. If you look at what's going to happen, I mean, according to projections in 30 years, for people who are in their teens now, there are going to be 3 billion people on this planet who are going to live in what we call informal settlements. Right now, that itself is a very complex term because informality comes from other disciplines. We use it in architecture and city planning. But the point is you're going to have 3 billion people living in a sense of temporariness, right? A sense of what we call the kacha, so to speak. This is a wonderful diagram that a colleague of mine at the School of Design at Harvard, Joan Busquets, who used to be the chief architect for Barcelona during the time of the Olympics, he talked about the city as having 3 aspects. It's urbanization, it's plot division, it's building. In the traditional city, urbanization was the monarch who decided, having tested it out with tents as a camp city, that this was going to settle as a city. That resulted in plot divisions. After the plot divisions, people build buildings. When you have the housing estates, as we see many gated communities today, turnkey, the developer collapses those 3 aspects. So you have urbanization, plot division, and building, and you get a key and you occupy a building. That's collapse. In informal housing, as 50% of this city, it's the opposite. You have building, then if someone rationalizes it, legitimizes it, you have plot division, and then you have urbanization. So it's a complete flip in terms of traditional ways of making the city. And I think employing architecture as the sole, permanent architecture as the sole instrument lies in those middle 2. It wasn't relevant then because it was tested. It's not relevant now as the only instrument, so to speak. So if you even look at towns, and I'm sort of giving you these sort of readings because it helps us contextualize and frame how we can see the importance of tents. Which is, towns were always conduits of the surplus from the countryside. They started with markets. People came, and then as you had merchants, they settled down. Merchants then began to build buildings. And then the city, beautiful Vienna, was the ultimate static city, which was all about architecture, and the markets began to disappear. So the coexistence of the temporary and the permanent is a very critical question. I think we've had that in our history, but we try to wish that away, where we, I think as human beings, strive for permanence, and therefore architecture helps us meet that goal. And so this aspiration for permanence and the notion of permanence of the temporary, I think is a very good framing. I think what Naman sort of shared with us would fall very well in that framework, because that's how history really played itself out. And these are the European landscapes. So this is when the merchants became wealthy. You had monarchs, cities developed, but the market continued. And so this kacha and pakka, the temporary and the permanent, were always part of an imaginary that existed. And I'm sure even in sort of records in India, which I don't have images to illustrate, you'd find the same. So really, planning today is challenged by this idea of how you blur all these binaries. We otherwise tend to reside in one of these worlds, and we create very contested spaces. And so how, as designers, and I'm speaking now as an architect, might we actually begin to engage with a new imaginary that allows some of these binaries, so to speak, to blur? And this led to my work, which is called the Kinetic City, which is how I describe Mumbai. It's a city in motion. It's a city where it's not a city that's only instrumentalized by architecture. I call this the landscape of impatient capital, because capital is inherently impatient. It finds territories which offer it no resistance, like Dubai, Shanghai, usually autocracies. It lands very quickly to realize its value. Our cities are something different, where architecture is one component of that spectacle. And so therefore, when at the end of this Ganesh festival, I think immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city. And here, as the clay idol dissolves in the bay, the spectacle comes to a close, and there are no permanent mechanisms to encode this spectacle. It's the memory and the recurrence on a kind of temporal scale. So that's a different imaginary, so to speak, of the city. And the implications are, how do you make space also for this? And that it's not architecture in its sort of spectacular form that is the only thing that occupies space or gives it definition. Basel Christmas market, this occurs even today, where for a month or two, this market is sort of set up. It's actually in dialogue with the permanent city. And I remember seeing these wonderful tents at this Basel market. I happened to be there just the week before I came to study the Kumbh Mela. And landing at the Kumbh Mela, suddenly all of this became very, very evident. And so therefore, we embarked on this project to study the Kumbh Mela. It's amazing, the Kumbh Mela is happening now, so in a funny way, the timing. We called it mapping the ephemeral megacity. A megacity is a city that has a population of 7 million people, and what's built at the Kumbh Mela for that 55 days is for a population of 7 million people. So it qualifies as a megacity. But it's an ephemeral megacity that lasts there for 55 days. Now, I'm not going to talk about this project because that would take a lot of time, but I'm going to share with you a few things. So, of course, the tented landscape is what is most prominent. Right, and this is just a video which you guys all know about the Kumbh, but it is really, it happens every 12 years, smaller cycles of 4 years, but it is really, it has all the attributes of a regular city, which is what our study was, and that was the thesis there, that it actually has governance systems, it has infrastructure, water supply, sanitation, I mean the whole host. It's a surrogate sort of creation, and of course it's humongous, it integrates existing infrastructure. It is a religious festival, so it's not very contested because it has a singular purpose. Cities like ours here in Mumbai, the contestations are so great that you never sort of have the clarity that something like the Kumbh Mela would have. And it is a tented city, and it's an expansive tented city which uses incredible forms of infrastructure, etc. It's also amazing how it appears, because that is a monsoon image of the Ganga and the Yamuna. And then when the waters recede after the monsoon, on the sand banks, a very light city places itself, which is the tented city. It has no foundations at all. And that bank, or the sand bank, changes every 12 years. So it's not like you can have a permanent plan for it. So what they do is they really employ a grid. That was an image I took in October when I went to survey where we were going to live. And we went back to the same spot on the 14th of January, and a whole city had appeared. Now, so you could call it a pop-up city. It's absolutely not a pop-up city. It is a deliberate state operation. The UP government plans it for 2 years in advance to every one of these cycles. It's deliberate, it's formal, land is allocated, leased, it has all the systems that a regular city would have. So we can't even call it a pop-up city because it's deliberate, but it demonstrates, the one thing I say, it was the most efficient and the cleanest Indian city I've ever lived in. It's just incredible how it's sort of operated. It's a grid that sits upon the grid, and then you have a perfect grid. Every road on the grid goes across in a pontoon bridge, so therefore it is incredibly robust. Imagine Manhattan or Kolkata with bridges across every road. You never have any circulation problems. So it's a very efficient sort of artifact as an urban system. But here's what's very interesting about it. The governance systems are very complex. I don't want to go into that. They're also temporal, which means the hierarchy of who's on top changes every month, so coming down to the Kumbh Adhikari, the Mela Adhikari, during the festival. So there's a temporality even in the governance structure, and that is absolutely amazing and something to learn from as we go into our crises with climate change. But what is important, and for me was really mind-blowing, is the whole city that you see above the ground is made up of 5 materials. 8-foot-tall bamboo, it's nails or screws, string or rope, and a skinning material, whether it's a corrugated sheet, canvas, textile, something that creates a skin. And these 5 materials, like a kit of parts, are deployed in an amazing variety, which allows it to be assembled in less than 4 weeks and disassembled in less than 2 weeks. And that's the sort of genius in the way this begins to actually appear. And there you see the scales, but it's all the same 5 materials that I just showed you. And it sort of is deployed in many, many different forms, which have sort of, I think, evolved over time. They're tentwalas, they're companies that have been involved in this for generations. And you have the scales like this. This is a community hall that was being built. And then once it's clad in the cloth, it has a completely different presence on the landscape. And then there's celebration all night. It's a community center. There are entire temples that are built in the same way, which then begin to take on a different kind of presence on the landscape. It's very light, very reversible, and gets deployed incredibly quickly. And this is what happens. This was an image we took 2 weeks after the Kumbh Mela was over. Except for the mats, nothing stays. Nothing sort of remains. And then the farmers come in and actually use these plots for one crop. And then the floods come in during the monsoon. It erases any memory. You can see some of the grid that's left. And so this is an ephemeral megacity that appears and disappears. So this made us think that, you know, this was a religious festival, and of course it's very particular. How does one expand this frame? So we actually expanded it by taking the idea of the kinetic and the idea of the city and making kinetic ephemeral and the city urbanism much more broadly. And then I think the question is, you know, when we talk about informality, we make a big basket and throw everything into it, whether it's markets, transactions, all of that. Actually, there's a whole taxonomy that appeared as we began to research, because this category of ephemeral urbanism as a complementary device for us to imagine cities could be quite powerful, because it would allow us a whole range of solutions, and I'll come to that in a second, by deploying this imaginary within the idea. I'm not arguing that we should make our cities all temporary. What I'm arguing, or what the research has made us argue, which is what led to this issue with Naman, is that this should be a complementary approach. It should infect the debate on architecture and urban design, which is focused so much on architecture and materiality as a way of organizing cities. And so we did this sort of exhibition and research project, which is called Does Permanence Matter? And it was an entire exhibition that was made using bamboo and cloth, like you would make tents. And this is the taxonomy that we came up with, which is the ephemeral landscapes of religion, the ephemeral landscapes of celebration, of transaction, that is markets, of extraction, which are mining towns, because mining towns also have an expiry date, because the resource copper is over. Sometimes it's 50 years, but the entire town is dismantled. Disaster, which has to happen very quickly. Military. Refuge, which is refugee camps. So that taxonomy helped us actually drill down into each of these categories more specifically in design terms. So I don't have the time again to show you all of that. I'm just going to take transactions to just show you the kind of methodology we developed. So this is the taxonomy as an overall matrix, and it sort of looks at how long each of these things exist. Some things have a rhythm of every weekend. Some things have a rhythm every month. Some things have a rhythm which are seasonal. Some things have a rhythm like the Kumbh Mela, which is 12 years, 4 years, and have a different temporal kind of rhythm. And we actually began, once we started mapping where these places were for religion, disaster, celebration, what I'm calling temporary settlements, it was mind-boggling. We came up with over 300 major major spaces of deployment of this kind of urbanism. And so in this book, we have sort of actually mapped religions. I mean, the whole taxonomy in terms of geography. So I'm just going to take you through transactions very quickly, and that leads me to what we did with tents, which is, this is in Mexico City, about 50,000 vendors kind of actually use parking lots during the weekends to set up markets. It's just for the weekends. It's 50,000 vendors. It's a whole system in itself which feeds the city in many ways. And so we, of course, mapped all the metrics. So the idea here was that we look at what is temporary through photography. Photographers capture this very beautifully. But how do you draw that into the metrics of planning? That was really the task of this research. And so these are the kinds of metrics we were looking at, where they exist, of course, in terms of their geographies, to look at different cultures that might employ this differently. This is just markets and transactions, how they appear, what time of the month, how long do they stay. So these were all mapped as, again, a set of metrics, matrix of photography, through photographs, representing some of this, descriptions of all of these, who's in charge, and then, of course, studying them using Google imagery to see how they were formed, how they appeared, but most importantly, actually converting them into metrics of drawings then. So you could actually get size, you could get density, you could get lengths, you could actually come up with numbers of costs if one had to use this within planning discussions. So it was really about drawing this into the vocabulary of urban design and planning, looking at markets like this one, which uses the sides of the rail, because this train comes there only once or twice a day, and the market is set up in a way, calibrated so carefully, as you can see, that it allows the train to go by, but it yet also sort of exists. So we studied all of that. They have canopies that can be pulled back, as you see in the images. So when the train is coming, someone whistles out and the canopies all go up, the train passes, and the canopies, these tents, come down. So again, how do you study it in the metrics of architecture and urban design, and how people occupy space, what is the logic by which they do this, etc. And so really, I think what got Naman and me both excited, where my research came from this direction, he was looking at the Mughal tents, textiles, and we really both agreed on the idea that tents are really the most enduring emblem of human settlements, and we see them omnipresent even today. And that's what gave rise to this issue, which Naman has already spoken about. And one of the essay that I did was really taking this research of the ephemeral and the enduring and talking about it, and also an essay on refugee camps, etc. So that's a COVID hospital in Central Park, and those are other tents that Naman has spoken about. So we began to look at refugee camps. We began to look at more contemporary deployments of the tent, again, as a unit of human settlement. And, we looked at the farmers' protests, we looked at Harvard Yard when the students were protesting, etc., how these get deployed to create formations that really are representative of some imaginary of settlements, whether it's for protest or otherwise. And then we also looked at tents as complements, and this is a wonderful sketch that actually Charles Correa made, where he looked at the Red Fort and Mughal courtyards. And we often go to the Fatehpur Sikri, and above the chhajjas of the courtyard, you always see a big circular a peg, and the guide always tells you that's where the flames were put on sticks so that they could light the court. And of course that's not true, because they were used to create attachments. And the sketch Charles Correa made showed how the Mughals, in the winter, they would during the day, they would let the sun shine and hit the floor of the courtyard, and at evening, at dawn, at sunset, they would stretch a shamiana over, so the hot air was trapped in the courtyard. And in the summer, they would do the opposite. So in a sense, textiles were always attachments to buildings, and that's why the lovely images that Naman showed, we see these buildings as raw artifacts when we go to Fatehpur Sikri or the Agra Fort, but they have to be imagined with their complements, because that also contributed to both their performative as well as their aesthetic quality. And that aspect is something, again, we highlighted. Naman showed you some of this, but I just wanted to point out their performative dimensions, which are also very important. And this is a building we've done in Ahmedabad, which is a library for Sept University, and that's how these attachments are used to cover the square during convocation, for example. So these are things one can actually deploy instead of building a convocation hall and spending a lot of material. Given all our talk about sustainability, this becomes a wonderful space with great atmosphere in the winter when the climate is good to have a convocation. So tents are about lightness, about agility, about adaptability, and they're ephemeral. They come, they go, they disappear. And the Bedouin tents that Naman talked about also have a performative dimension. Their geometry varies depending on where they are pitched to respond to the wind, to the sand that might blow through, and so they are agile in that they can take a form, and so therefore the master who puts the tent up, I mean, Naman mentioned they have the status of the governor. Among these tribes too, this was an expertise which was also about not just giving shelter to you for the night, but also situating it in a way that climatically it was protection, which was very critical, and so they became passive condensers in a sense to live in. And they have wonderful sort of documentation both in the issue but otherwise too about the logic by which these are deployed. And then if you look at Fry Otto's tents for the Munich Olympics, which was just mind-blowing, of course it's absolutely inspired by these traditions of tents. And of course this is a tensile structure. It's yet remained, it hasn't been dismantled, but implicit in its construction techniques, materiality, and geometry, it could easily be dismantled. In fact, why should the Olympics be such a burden on every city for creating stadiums that are often not even used after the Olympics go because their capacity? London was very clever that they made stadiums, the swimming aquatics, which could shrink. They had one pneumatic structure. Actually, Olympics with the technology we have should be like circuses. They should be a traveling show without which the Olympic Committee should own, and they can deploy as they go to different cities. So that's another imaginary in terms of scaling this up as infrastructure, whether it's cultural. I was going to suggest to Mr. Mukherjee at the end of this lecture, I've never talked here, that my next project here is going to be a big mosquito mesh tent here, so you can have lovely lectures in the evening. It would be absolutely amazing. And then, of course, we looked at the Hajj terminal, which is also a series of tents, which is successfully used even today for protection. It's right next to the airport. And then Fry Otto, of course, a pioneer, Shigeru Ban, who makes these sort of tented structures using bamboo and wood in different ways. And then we also looked at ordinary tents, and this is a wonderful article by someone called Nusrat, who is a DDes or a PhD student at Harvard. She's just graduated. She was looking at markets in Bangladesh. This is the cover of the issue, and that's why her article was called Ordinary Tents. She was looking at markets, just ordinary places and ordinary people using tents as protection. And just look at the patterns that these forms in terms of pixel. When Naman saw these images, he said, I've decided what I'm putting on the cover. And then we ended it with, in a sense, this wonderful project by Dar, which is, their title is Permanent Temporariness. And what they did was they made a refugee tent, but they poured it in concrete just to get the idea across that the temporary is becoming the new permanent. And this was an installation where the names of the children that were killed in Gaza was recited. It was a recording, and you sat in it, and as you see people sitting down, it was an art installation to remind people about some of those horrors. But it was poured in concrete. It's very beautifully done. It's concrete, but it simulates sort of textile. And so we both thought that was a good provocation, in a sense, to end the article. And that's how it sits in the landscape. It sits really in the desert, and it's a very beautiful object. So I just want to end with just some new research which I think makes me very excited and propels, for me, the idea of the incredible relevance of looking at not only ephemerality, but also looking at tents, or the idea of a tent in more serious terms. And so this is the book that I talked to you about. And these are the kind of research questions that are interesting me, which have partly been triggered off with my conversations with Naman and with doing this project, which is this notion of uncertainty. How do we nuance uncertainty on a temporal scale? Because uncertainty is what leads us to creating things that are permanent. What are the life cycles of material? We design just thinking, this thing, oh, you must make a house that will last 100 years. We should question that, because you could also design a house for a weekend that lasts 20 years, because once you're too old to use it or your kids don't come and hang out with you, you could dismantle it, right? So the ephemeral becomes important. And how do we therefore embed this notion of temporality in our disciplinary thinking as architects, as urban designers? And how do we theorize permanence and temporality for the idea of the home? Because the home is where we have the instinct that it must be permanent. So therefore, in housing or in dwelling, how do we take this idea of the temporary becoming the permanent? And so this notion of the permanent temporariness could be an interesting idea. This is, and just 3 or 4 more images. This is on the Novartis campus in Basel. Novartis has a wonderful campus where they have 30 architects from around the world who've done a building each. And I was really intrigued by this when I visited the campus. This is a building by Frank Gehry. But the scientists in the Frank Gehry building, in the good weather, they build this temporary structure which they use for their lunch and for coffee. They don't use the cafe in the building, and there's no reflection on Frank Gehry. This is not a criticism of Frank Gehry, but it's a criticism of the impulse to have something which maybe is temporary, maybe it triggers memories of something else. And it was just intriguing for me that you had this temporariness next to a building which must have cost $1 billion. And the scientists here, this is not ordinary workers, these are the scientists who prefer having their meals in this. Now, whether they were commenting on the Gehry building or not, I don't know, but it was an important question. And this is an image which Naman found, which was the image that closes the issue, which is a wedding in Dubai. So in that landscape of impatient capital where everything is air-conditioned and everything is built, a wedding yet happens in this tent. So what does architecture in a time of flux mean? And I think this notion of temporality, the idea of the tent, the 2 directions Naman and I have come from and sort of intersected in the middle ground, I think has a lot of potential for research and I think can trigger ideas. On a completely unrelated note, I'm going to just leave you with a provocation, which is, I'm zooming out now, and this is current research we are doing, is asking the question, what is urban? We haven't asked ourselves that question hard enough. For us, urban is when we see buildings and it seems like a city, right? Those are the night lights of urbanization in India. I mean, Mumbai doesn't even stop here, it just spreads. We don't map it because we have a municipal boundary and we have an MMRD boundary. So what does urbanization, what does even the word urban mean? I believe the urban-rural binary is not even relevant as a discussion today. That is blurred long time ago. In India today, there are 3 criteria for the government to declare something urban. One criteria is that settlement must have a population of over 5,000 people. It should have a density of 400 people per square kilometer. It must have, this is bizarre, this has got a weird background, but it should have over 75% of the male population in non-agricultural employment. So that means you're working in industry and things, because if you're in agriculture, then you're rural, is the given. Now we know that's not true. I mean, everyone from UP comes and works here for 3 months, goes back for 3 months, they do kheti kaise chal rahi hai. Those are the normal conversations that you have. So these are bizarre criteria, but our planning, our infrastructure deployment, our imagination of where airports should be, where the bullet train should go, all of that is based on this, I believe, ill-founded reading of the urban. So this is how the government defines urban. Small dots and big dots, right? There are small cities, big cities, mega cities, etc. You have categories. They're about 7,523, I think it might be 7,600 towns that are divided by class, but that are accepted as being towns, which have municipalities, and therefore they have infrastructure that, investments for infrastructure, a municipality, all of that, which sort of implies that. So we took this data, we took it down to the village level, we got the data, we bought it from the government actually, and began to spatialize it to see what does it mean, does this really represent urban India? And so when we took the first criteria of the minimum population of 5,000, that's how urban India looks, which is very close to the night lights, which is a proxy, right? You tell you where people are living. If you took the second criteria of 400 people per square kilometer as the density, the world's biggest megacity goes from Kashmir to Calcutta. It's got 300 million people who live there, which is essentially the Indo-Gangetic Plain. It's a completely different reading of urbanization because it is 400 people per square kilometer as the density. Now, in this, there'll be places that are 20,000 people per square kilometer. This is just an average. But this is worthy of being called a city, which is the whole Indo-Gangetic Plain. If you take the criteria, so this is the criteria of density, but if you take the criteria of 75% of the people working, male people working in non-agriculture, the whole Indo-Gangetic Plain changes, and this becomes, so Kerala stays steady, because that's a steady rural-urban kind of continuum. And then you have some pockets in Rajasthan, interestingly, and in Bengal, right? So it's interesting, these are such diametrically opposite readings of the urban if you use these criteria at a fine grain, right? So I believe we are reading our urbanity, what is urban, where the focus should be, completely wrong. Why am I saying all of this? This is what we called it reverse migration. Why we use the word migration for our own people moving between here and there, I don't know. But this reverse migration occurred because exactly of this. These folks are also doing work in these areas from the Indo-Gangetic Plain, right? So what the research summarizes, and I'm not going to go into too many details, is that actually this is a true map of urban India. Out of these, there are something like 15,000 by now. This is slightly older data because we haven't done the census, as you know, for 10 or 12 years. But we have about 15,000 places in India, some which have 200,000 people, some have even more, which are yet defined as villages. And that's why we are calling them transitioning settlements. These are settlements that have all the attributes of the urban, but they're yet defined as the rural. So what India is going to go through in terms of its urban trajectory is an explosion. The urban time bomb is lying with those transitioning settlements. It's going to be about 200 million inhabitants in places that are urban but being called rural, which means they don't have public health. So it's going to be a time bomb for public health, sanitation, all of that. And so I believe that if we begin to think about urban design, if we have to put up cultural institutes, hospitals, I think going back to looking at the temporal, to looking at material life cycles, to be inspired by tents, to be inspired by mobile cities in a contemporary way, and that's why I showed you Fry Auto and others who've done Olympic stadiums, I think is worth our attention, because otherwise I think we're not going to come anywhere close to solving our urban problems. So I'm sorry I kind of expanded to another scale, more as a provocation, but really to say that I think for me the exciting thing, Naman, about what this issue has done, at least to me at a personal level, is made me think harder about the relevance of the temporal, the ephemeral, and all the kind of thinking potentially that the idea of the tent, this most enduring emblem of human settlements, can do for us. So thank you very much.
That certainly gives us lots to chew about. You know, we in the museum world, and I curate exhibitions, and I'm an art historian. I've studied as an archaeologist. I look at sculpture and iconography, and I try and tell the history of human civilization through objects that we keep in the museum. And here we are talking about the history of civilization, where languages and cultures and beauty gets created in something that cannot be kept in a museum because it is ephemeral. It'll disappear. And so our institutions don't have a mechanism for telling human history. And we have the conceit as museum professionals to imagine that we are telling the history of civilization, when all we are telling the history of is the accidents that have survived and happen to have come to us, on the basis of which we can tell the history of culture. Because the larger history of humanity cannot be put in this institution. And culture is something which is so much larger and has so much more to it that it just cannot be put into the physical space of a gallery. So I think we need to think about this a little bit as we embark on what is the limiting nature of our own role as professionals working in our fields, and to think that this is the accident and this is the by chance of what has survived with which we can tell our histories. And I think that's what is something really important that you've really forced us in this to think about. I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I don't know what to, I mean, I think, and also Naman, things you said, which I just would expand. You know, I touched upon very briefly the idea of absolute solutions versus transitionary solutions. And thinking of designing transitions is a completely different field, right? Because the absolutism is easy because it's an end state thing. You imagine it and you try to build it. You're half successful. You have half incomplete buildings, right? But designing a transition is sometimes going in a completely... So the example I use is India's India's energy policy, which, you know, we decided under Manmohan Singh and the Bush administration in America to go nuclear. Because if India tried to go from fossil fuels to renewables, our economy would collapse. So we chose to go nuclear to come that way. Now that's a seemingly completely different direction. I think we need to do that without thinking about urbanism, cities, and that's where these kinds of deployments can happen, you know.
I don't know, I mean, we've talked about various things. If anyone has any questions that they'd like us to try and field, we can. If there are any issues that have come up in your mind, any responses. And yes, there's a question here. Jyotsna's.
The question is for you, expectedly, Rahul. Yeah, okay. Rahul, you've been, I mean, you're training as an architect, which is the exact opposite of the kinetic city, but yet you have been following this whole thing. What has really alarmed me listening to you is that how much of this, if I may say, subaltern view of urbanization impacting what we think of urbanization today. Because I think it's going in a completely different direction. So do you think there's hope?
I always think there's hope. I mean, that's a short answer. But you know, Bachi, I think it's wow, mangoes falling, wonderful. Yeah, luckily. No, I think, Bachi, that's a very good point. And I think it's not, I think what I would argue for is we all, as human beings, whether it's in our politics, it's a pendulum that swings to extremes, right? And I think it's a matter of both. It's a matter of how one can deploy both. And we are not doing that enough because the disciplines of architecture, the discipline of urban design is all premised on the artifact of the building with a view of permanence being central. Now, with climate change, with the lack of resources, I think we have to really rethink that and how we make these transitions. So, look, I'm here with a group of students and we've been doing field work. We were on Sunday all day in New Bombay. And, you know, it strikes you how, with, you know, Marine Drive and all of that, I mean, although my family lives there, I can say in 20 years, these are going to be unlivable with climate change, with the flooding, with all of that. We're going to have to make this retreat. New Bombay, they should have never cut that Ulwe Hill to make the international airport because we're going to need every high point to survive in this city. The question is, how do you make that transition? So let me take the example of the museum. Mr. Mukherjee becomes one of the pioneers to try to make this managed retreat. I think it would be a mistake for him to replicate a massive building there, but if Mr. Mukherjee started taking fry autos, tents, and having cultural events there and beginning to trigger off No, trigger off focuses there. No, as you know, in the old New Bombay plan with Shirish Patel, Charles Courier, they had, and Praveena Mehta, they had said Mantralaya should move there as a focus. When you do these managed retreats or when you reorchestrate the urban landscape, you need anchors that begin to trigger off this kind of growth to identify. And that's what's wonderful about what Naman talks about the Mughal cities, because they were tested in a way. So this kind of architecture can be used as a way to test the ground, to test locations, and to trigger off in a way. I mean, why were they saying, when the young planners for New Bombay were saying the Mantralaya should go there? Because then it's a signal that there's a commitment to be there, right? And so then other people go and invest and things like that. And so the cultural infrastructure does the same thing. So I think it's a matter of how we deploy both. And there's hope if we think like that. If we continue to keep building the buildings we're building in Parel and going higher and higher and higher and higher, we are doomed, you know.
Thank you for that lovely talk, both of you. Rahul, a few years ago when I came across the idea of the kinetic city, I found it so deeply seductive, but also utopian, almost impossible, because the fact is that our cities are embedded in the PAN card, the Aadhaar card, which require this idea of permanence. The fact that even human psychology, you know, the fact that a lot of people dream to have certain houses, and this dream is located in the market economy, in capitalism, private property. So how do you take this idea of the kinetic city, and when it is flying in the face of what it means to be human, successful today? You know, how do you encounter human psychology, the government policies?
You know, I mean, when I wrote that kinetic city, which you are referring to, it was a reading of the city. I was just trying to say, look, you have to read the city in this way to even understand how you act on it, right? So if I was in the government, for example, we are looking at New Bombay, I think to what we both spoke about, you know, so when we make a development plan, it's all fixed, no? This is open space, that's this, that, this. But by the time everything is taken up, there are a few open spaces left barely for us, and those are marked for sports or something. We could actually reserve 30% of the land. That's what I learned from the Kumbh Mela. I mean, not directly, but indirectly. We could, in our planning, as we plan new cities, we extend new cities, we should keep much more land for temporal uses, which is don't lock it up permanently with a use, right? You can test it. You could say that this sort of zone of 4 acres is going to be kept for markets. Let them be temporary, and every 2 years we'll review this. Now, politics is the right word. You need people with insight, people with a commitment. You need maybe patronage of different kind, right? When I say patronage, I'm almost referring to monarchical systems, because those are patronages which could dictate stuff like this. And that's why many cities under autocracy we admire Singapore and Shanghai and Dubai for the wrong reasons. But essentially, even let's say, I assume I accept your admiring of it, you're admiring monarchies, right? So they can make those decisions. So it means a rethink. And you need something major to happen where survival will allow or force you to think like that. So in the kinetic city, my provocation is merely, if you don't recognize the flux in the city, the temporality as actually cultural and intrinsic to the existence of the city, we won't find solutions. Everything will be counter. So let's say the Aadhaar card implies permanence, but you yet shop on the sidewalk in a temporary market, right? So I think it's a matter of how you combine these things. And I think with the digital technology, it's fantastic. Warwick Junction in South Africa, in Durban, I visited it as a case study, and there's someone called Richard Dobson there who's done a fantastic job. They have 20,000 vendors there. And what he did was he created sidewalks. He put a little copper number on them, a little platform off the sidewalks. He has a copper number. They have a system. There's a lottery every morning on who gets what for how many hours. it works beautifully. When the market is not there, it's the most usable sidewalk. When the market is there, there's no mafia involved because no one appropriates space. So there are enough examples of how people have taken temporality and embedded it into planning practices. I'm just giving you one example. And I think we need to push ourselves as disciplines, and so this is a call really to architects, urban designers, planners to shift the conversation to some of these mechanisms or ways of doing things.
This is to Rahul again. You've been to the Kumbh Mela, and I would be interested to know what happens to the sanitation after this multitude of people.
Yeah, so, this one, I think, is, I don't know whether there are too many people, but the year we went, there wasn't so much debris and pollution in the Ganges itself. What for the river, where the Sangam is and things, they actually flush it, which means upstream they open the barrage so the water keeps moving. But that's one aspect. But they have over 500 toilets there, and they actually have toilets with septic tanks embedded in the sand, which absorbs it beautifully. That's why the farmers go and do one crop after the Kumbh Mela is over. It's very fertile soil. But they actually have a whole sanitary system with water supply pipes. It really, and that's what the book documents, it has attributes of a regular city. And a lot of that can be salvaged, like the electricity poles, some of the water supply lines. They get then redistributed into the hinterland of Uttar Pradesh. The thing that we couldn't study because our decision to go there was very late, but it's a subject of a very good PhD thesis, would be to study the material geography, where the material comes from, how it's absorbed, and then it's how it's reabsorbed in the hinterland. Whether it's the bamboo for the tents, some of the textile is saved, but some of it is then used for, recycled and used for. That's a fascinating thing to study and extends this idea, I think, in substantial ways if someone did that.
Sorry. Yeah, it's with me. I mean, as a historian, I was pretty intrigued with what you've spoken about at the behest of the conversation. Rahul, sorry again, this question is temporarily directed towards you. In your work of the kinetic city, you illustrate how temporality plays a crucial role in shaping urban spaces, particularly through ephemeral structures like festival, or even for that matter, the festival tents that you spoke about. If cities are fundamentally shaped by people, their stories, in my personal idea, cities are fundamentally shaped by people, their stories, cultures, and ideas, how do you see temporality negotiating with permanence in the evolution of urban identities?
Very much, no. I think what I've argued there, now that you've read it all so carefully, is that it's the associative values with space that construct the identity of the city. And so for me, actually, the reference that I make to the Ganesh festival and immersion becomes a metaphor for the spectacle of the city actually came through my conversations with Raghubir Singh, the photographer. Because when he was doing his book on Bombay, when he was showing me his dummies, I was stunned by the fact that he didn't use the skyline of Mumbai, but rather the Ganesh immersion on the cover. And in my conversations with him, that's when it struck me that, through the lens, that filter of the photographer's imagination, that had struck him as the identity of the city, and that was identity for me. So it's temporal, it's an enacted moment, like the Durga Pujas in Calcutta, which we've covered in the magazine, but these have lingering memories that are about identity construction. See, identity is finally what we identify with as a society. And if those become representative as spectacles that you identify as, the moment in the spectacle of the city, that's identity construction. Naman will have something to say on this.
No, I think that's fine. That covers it. And I think we always have these issues about identity construction, cultural values, which are through these ephemeral buildings, and they're used for all kinds of purposes that we've looked at in this. So that's certainly UNESCO coming up with its category of intangible heritage. and intangible culture was pretty far-sighted. We've never really known what to do with that category adequately, and how important it is, how much attention we need to pay to it, as we think only in terms of permanence all the time. So it's something worth bearing in mind. Yeah, you've been waiting.
Okay, thank you so much for that talk. Both of you spoke about planned tented settlements, but you touched upon the spontaneous ones. For example, protests. I think tents really act as a symbol of democracy when you think about protests. Be it the protests like the farmers' protests that you mentioned in India, or be it the recent Sri Lanka protests where they built a whole mega city, or in Egypt before to stash out their president, basically. These tents became a place of conversation, of democracy, of debate, much what we as formal architects try to do in our buildings, but we cannot replicate the character of those tents. So what do you think we need to learn from these spontaneous tent settlements, and how does it redefine the role of the architect?
Well, it certainly is something that redefines the role of the planner. And it allows the planner to think about our species and our movement in all kinds of interesting ways, because we are also confronted with, in the 20th century, with the largest amount of migration in the world. And with an increasing number of wars and refugee camps, we're looking at a requirement where enormous parts of our population, not just because of wars, but because of climate change, etc., we're going to go back to living in and being mobile. Nomadism is not something which is just in the past. It's an intrinsic part of our species and who we are. So migration is something that we need to think about. And when we think about migration more, we need to think about cultural identity quite differently, which is what Rahul was saying just now. That what epitomizes a culture, we seem to be so fixated on what it means to be from Bombay or from Delhi or from India or from Punjab, quite forgetting that, you know, we got legs and we've come there from somewhere and made that into our identity. And so what oftentimes epitomizes a cultural identity is something which is quite ephemeral and is not something that we can put something permanent to. So architects are also mobile, you know, they too will travel with people and make these new spaces wherever we go. They won't be left behind wherever they are. So I think with that, we'll call it a day for today. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Cyrus. Thank you, Mr. Mukherjee, and the museum for hosting us. And thank you all very much for supporting us here at Marg. So thank you.